fast, so we've got a good hour together, and we do want to save some time at the end for some small group discussions, so I hope you like who you're sitting around. I'm Paige Heverly. I work at Vital Communities in the Energy and Transportation programs, and
my name is Angela Zhang. I'm the Programs Director at Listen Community Services. We're a nonprofit based in Lebanon, Pittsburgh, but we serve Windsor and Orange County.
And Vital Communities is based in White River Junction, but serves the Upper Valley region, which is whoever knows, but could reach as far up here and as far south as Walpole, New Hampshire. So we've got quite a reach, and we've kind of gotten together because of our group with the Energy Advocacy Council, of which we are the co-chairs.
Yes, which we will discuss more later on in the presentation. Yeah.
So we'll get started. We don't have a little clicker, so forgive me staring at this black mirror thing. Ooh, okay. So
can you raise the that on the screen?
We can't.
Maybe?
But we could. Does anybody have a large book?
Mine's a flag under there.
Yeah, no lag underneath it.
There's a tripod.
Take anything you want out of this bag. I'm sure you can prop it on as you want.
There you go.
Your wallet.
My wallet's sticking up.
Fungible stuff in there.
That's too high.
Fine, okay. I mean, just stick this under here.
I think the leg will be
You got it.
good.
Oh,
Is that everybody can see fine?
Much better.
Okay. Can you hear okay? There's like a buzzing thing up here, so if I'm screaming, please tell me. So, we got into this work. I'm kind of the energy side, and Angela is the human services side. So we want to kind of coalesce around a definition of what the energy burden means. And the kind of textbook definition that you might find in reports like the Vermont Law School, Energy Costs and Burdens, Burdensome for Whom, or the VEIC report that maps the total energy burden, will say something around it's the percentage of household income that is spent on energy expenditures. And some figures include transportation, others don't, but essentially it's how much is your household spending on energy as a percentage of the income. And so when you think of energy costs, we're not just talking about electricity, we're not just talking about thermal needs, we're also including that transportation. So everything it takes to keep the lights on and function in our society. And generally, those who spend more than 10% of their income on energy are considered fuel poor, and that's a kind of a federal figure.
What was that term? Fuel?
Fuel poor, or they're in fuel poverty. And so what else we know about energy burden is that it's increasing, and this is a chart taken or adapted from this Vermont Law School report. If you haven't seen this, I have a copy here that I'd be happy to give to you, or it's available online and I'm happy to send it to you too. But the energy burden has been increasing over time, and this is a chart that shows a lot of things, so don't get freaked out. So it is first broken into decile of household income. So these are the top earners up here, and first is the lowest income earners. So that's kind of the first thing to know. The bars show how much real dollars were spent on energy. The darker gray is more recently, that is in 2012, and the lighter gray is in 2000. And this is the most recent data that was crunched in that report. And then the lines show percentage. So the yellow line shows, which is the lower one, shows percentage of income spent on energy in 2000, and the orange line shows in 2012. So you can see for every income bracket, that percentage of income spent on energy is increased, but it is increased exponentially for the lower income earners. Are there any kind of questions about this chart?
Is this Vermont? Or
This is Vermont specific, yeah.
My hearing isn't very good. Is it okay if I
Yeah,
speak?
please.
Okay, thanks.
Could you speak?
Yeah,
Is that combined energy use, electricity and fuel?
that's electricity and thermal, yeah,
But not
but
transportation?
not transportation. So again, everyone has an energy burden, but for some, it is worse. or a greater percentage. And it's also worth noting that if you have a smaller income, spending almost 30% of that on energy is going to hurt you more than if you were spending 30% of a larger income. They're not, this top income bracket isn't spending anywhere close to 30%, we're around 2%, which is what we would hope to see for all income levels. It's just another way of showing that it's a disproportionate burden. This shows the percentage of household spending more than 10%. So that last chart was an average of that decile. And this shows how many of the people in that income bracket are spending more than 10%. So it's a slightly different way of looking at it. You can see that in that lowest decile of income, nearly 2/3, or nearly 3/4, are spending more than 10% of their income on their energy costs. And it kind of steps down, but you can see, maybe one of these top income earners is spending more than 10%. So it's not unheard of to spend more than 10%, even if you earn more. Yeah.
Any idea like how many people are represented in each of those brackets?
I'm not sure. I think it's divided 10% each.
Oh,
Population.
So it'd be like 62,000
oh, I see.
in each. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a figure out of this Vermont Law School report that says 1 in 5 Vermonters is spending more than 10% on their energy costs. But as you look at that down the line, some are spending way more than 10%, as this shows. Yes.
And why are we using 10% as a keynote for what you should spend more or less than on? What is the rationale behind that?
I think it's kind of a normal household budget. I'm not exactly sure where that comes from, that 10% number, but I think it's an easy thing to wrap your head around.
Because it used to be also for like rent.
Sure.
You spend a third of your income on rent, and that's been skewed over the years also.
Sure.
As rents have gone up.
And we'll talk about it. Steve, yeah.
It used to be the standard was 25% of your rent, 1 week out of a 4-week month.
Yeah.
And because of the increase in housing costs, HUD sort of acknowledged that by raising the bar to 30%.
Mm-hmm.
That's still, an unachievable goal for many of the low-income people that we're most concerned about, who typically spend at least 50%, if not 75% of their income on housing costs, including energy.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of times budgets will break out housing from energy costs. So it is important to note that those things are related. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then kind of getting out of the numbers, it's not just that you're spending a lot of money on energy. It's that you're spending money on energy that you're not spending on other things. And Angela, who's in the human services world, has stories every day.
Yeah, so at Listen, our mission is to support the critical needs of Upper Valley families and individuals. And so we became involved in this because we have we call it Heating Helpers program, which is basically we assist families with their heating and electric needs once every 12 months, sometimes more than that depending on their situation. And so we hear just like so many stories. We serve over 400 families a year, and that number has just been growing. And so one of the stories that sticks out the most in my mind, it was a fellow I worked with last December. It was and he came in to see us right in the middle of the really bad cold snap when it was like below -20 for like a 2-week period. So he lives in a mobile home, and some time ago his propane tank broke in his house. Or sorry, like basically his heating system really needed repair. And because he's on a fixed income, a really limited budget, he did not have the $2,000 or so needed to repair his heating system. And because of that, his only choice was to start using space heaters in his home, which of course is really inefficient and also really dangerous, honestly. And so he's filling his house with space heaters, and he's racking up a huge electric bill. And because of that, the electric company threatened to disconnect him in the middle of the winter when it's -20. And so this man also has diabetes. So the cost of insulin has risen enormously in the past couple of years. And so he's faced with this choice, which is, do I pay off this disconnect bill or do I pay for my insulin, which was coming out to like $250 a month. And I think he only had like a $700 like Social Security income to begin with. And so he's faced with this choice. He chooses the insulin. And because of that, his electricity is shut off. And soon after that, his pipes freeze. And basically, he's forced out of his home. His home is no longer inhabitable. So he came to us looking for help, and so we were trying to get him reconnected to electricity and also to help fix his heating system. But this is, I think, a really good example of how the energy burden is disproportionate, as Paige has been talking about, and also that it's one piece of a larger puzzle. Is a really great point that like housing costs are increasing, but also like many other kinds of costs, including healthcare, are increasing, and also that something like this can cause a financial crisis, and that like it's cascading, so that one bad thing happens, and then this has like constant ramifications that really rapidly become much worse than the original problem. And so that's sort of one of the stories that sticks out most in my mind, just to put a human face on it.
And for kind of on this health topic, the World Health Organization defines adequate warmth in a home in the main living room as 69.8 degrees. I think all of us are like, whoa, put a sweater on.
What was that definition?
The adequate warmth in a home. So in the main living room, it is like the space you're going to be in the most. It's 69.8 degrees.
69.8?
Which is a really, who knows where 69.8 comes from.
Right.
And in all other rooms, 64.4 degrees.
64.4.
Again, the points, whatever. But I think most Vermonters, certainly, and most folks in New England would say that's toasty. But that is to account for the most vulnerable populations. So we're talking about elderly people, children developing, again, Vermont.
I guess I almost qualify as elderly now, and I can't take the heat. It makes me sick to be heated, so I'm taking issue with that.
Sure, and I think it's more of a, when you start to think of how a building functions, if you have colder air, you're going to have the places where there is warm air condensing on that cold surface, you're having more moisture in the home, you're having more respiratory problems from that, and so it's kind of, again, this cascading thing of, if you're not warm, where are the effects down the line coming? We've also seen more damp, cold conditions affecting children's development. Children that are in poverty are having missing school because of a cough or a cold, then getting bad marks, and it's kind of this cycle that continues. So again, it's not just how much are we spending on energy that we can't spend on other stuff, it's how is this affecting people's actual outcomes in life? And pretty significantly, we're seeing that. And as we've kind of talked about a little bit, the energy burden is exacerbated by these outside factors. So one important thing to note is that energy burden is not just caused by how much energy costs. It is a function of the cost as it relates to an income. So if your income rises at a rate greater than the cost of energy rises, you can deal with that. It's going to stay around the same percentage. But if your wages are stagnant, like we've seen since 1975, and energy prices are volatile or increasing at a rate that you can't keep up with wages, and maybe your housing costs are increasing, that proportion of your real income that you're spending on energy is going to go up. And it's also a function of the source of energy. So as we saw in the EAN report, cord wood, electricity through cold climate heat pumps, those are more predictable rates for what you're spending for fuel. Natural gas to a lesser extent, but propane and number two, heating oil are all over the board. And how does a family living on a fixed income or an individual on a fixed income really take that into account? I know I'm a renter, but from last winter and the one before, my energy costs were significantly different just because of the global energy markets, and how does an individual really take control of that? It's really hard. Housing stock is another big contributor to this. if you as an individual can't control your energy costs, what could you control? Maybe the efficiency of the home is one way. If you increase efficiency more than the cost of energy increases, now you're starting to be able to chip away and insulate yourself and your home from that increasing burden. And then heating degree days, we talked about this a little too, with EAN saying, there's some other factors that might reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as a state. As individuals, if you have a more heating degree days or a longer winter, that is obviously going to increase your heating costs. But if you have these kind of volatile negative 20-degree stretches and then a 30-degree stretch, that makes it really difficult to plan, and your burden might be higher. And we'll talk about how assistance is paid out, but energy assistance doesn't take into account how many heating degree days there are, as a benefit that's paid to the actual individual or the family.
I was also just going to mention really quick that I think more and more we're also seeing people needing energy assistance during the summers, because if they're, as the summers are also getting warmer, that especially folks who have medical conditions or are seniors and who need air conditioning, it is really important to their health to have air conditioning, and they're also running into higher energy burdens, and that this issue is not just because the winters are cold, but also summers are getting warmer too.
And that speaks to Laurel's need too. And Vermont historically has been a winter peaking state, but as our climate changes, we're starting to see some of those things change. And as we've talked about, energy prices are increasing. This is kind of the volatility. I think we've talked about this, but being able to go with these ones that have lower volatility will obviously reduce the burden. But something to note, one moment, is that 46%, almost half of Vermonters, are using heating fuel. So there's a big chunk of people who are in this cycle of volatility and increasing prices. We do have a lot of folks heating with cordwood, but it's still less than 20%. Yeah, Paul.
Showing electricity costs as a steady thing. If you were heating with electricity in a poorly insulated building like that trailer, that's not a good graph to show the impact on that individual or the burden.
Sure.
That's not, electricity is not less of a burden because you have a heat pump in a junky building. A heat pump is as bad as any other, electricity is as bad as any other fuel in a poorly insulated building.
I agree, and that is why this chart is showing the change in real price of energy source. So if what we're doing, I will also argue that a heat pump, as opposed to resistance electricity, actually is more efficient because it's transferring heat, but I would also agree that putting a heat pump in a poorly insulated home is never a good idea. This is simply talking about the volatility of an energy source, and if we are going to be advocating for folks using electricity for heating, it should never be resistance heating, it should never be space heaters, it should never be an electric oven open. It should only be combined with efficiency measures to actually make a real difference.
Well, I would argue with your premise. The premise should be that you should never be using we shouldn't have poorly insulated buildings. So we're spending energy here on worrying about what fuel we use. We're wasting it all because we're putting it, the impetus should be on having structures that need as little of that stuff as possible. And so we're putting our human energy in the wrong place.
I don't
Talking
disagree.
About,
I don't disagree with that. But
We
we're,
get to that a
but we're in
little-
reality.
Right,
Yeah.
right, exactly.
And there are
poorly insulated
and there are
buildings.
urgent needs that need to be met.
But the reality is that they can be fixed. And so but that's hard work. And we don't want the hard work, we want the easy work. Let's give out money and not really change the building.
So,
Steve.
You're kind of referring to in generalities, sort of saying we don't want the hard work. I think as a whole, the policy of the state and the intent of the state is to vastly increase the amount of weatherization that is done, the amount of increased energy efficiency in our building stock in the state. What we're not willing to do, what we don't have the political will to do, is to raise the money to do that. And it takes a lot more money per household to fully weatherize a home, especially some of these older homes, than it does to give them, a supplemental assistance for their energy assistance each year. And frankly, as one of the agencies that provide that assistance, we could not support taking all the money that we provide fuel assistance for, the state provides fuel assistance for, and saying, we're not going to do that anymore, we're just going to weatherize homes. And until you're on the list, until your time comes up on the waiting list, well, that's too bad. I mean, we have to look at the current reality and how we get to that without,
we'll talk more about the funding.
without punishing people who need that assistance,
Yeah.
in a critical way.
We'll talk about the funding now.
Depends a little bit on it.
So,
I agree.
let's talk about what assistance is available, and right now is a great time to talk about LIHEAP. So it's run through the Department of Health and Human Services. Those folks are in the completely different section of Department of Energy folks who talk about energy efficiency, structural problem. Each state administers it differently. In this year's budget, Congress appropriated $3.69 billion to LIHEAP. And this funding, again, each state kind of decides what to do with it. You can use it for weatherization, but by and large, it's for fuel assistance. Vermont has kind of chosen a different revenue stream for weatherization assistance that we'll talk about next. There's some federal eligibility guidelines there. And essentially, in Vermont, the benefit that is paid to recipients for heating assistance, which we'll get into a little more, but an individual household can receive at minimum $21 towards their heating bills, and at maximum a little over $1,500. And if we go back to that chart that showed how much people are spending, it doesn't meet the need. So a lot of states have called it supplemental fuel assistance. And there's also funding for crisis fuel, which we'll talk about more, that only reaches around $644 maximum to each household. And in Vermont, 21,000 households have received fuel assistance, and over 2,000, close to 3,000 have received this crisis fuel assistance.
Can you? That's for the season?
That's for each season, yeah. That's in 1 year.
The difference between the LIHEAP, the seasonal fuel for heating, and the crisis fuel is that the heating dollars are fixed.
Yeah.
So that is, you get
Yep, and we'll talk.
assessed, and you get credited a certain amount of money
Right.
to
Yep.
purchase fuel.
We're-
With crisis, it's not a specific dollar amount. It's a number of crisis assists you're allowed to get
Yeah.
at a minimum number of gallons, and so it depends entirely on the cost per gallon of your heating fuel that determines what the amount in dollars would be for an individual as a maximum.
Sure. And this is the federal kind of max that they've posted. So this tends to deal with that fuel side, the kind of the supply side, and then weatherization assistance is a whole different bucket of funding. And you can see here that Vermont is receiving only close to about $1.5 million for this program from the feds. And that has stayed it's gone up a little bit, but I didn't do the exact calculation, but I doubt that that's even increased with inflation in real dollars. Vermont, again, these are federal eligibility guidelines that you have to be no less than 150% of the federal poverty level. In Vermont, that's for a 4-person household is around $37,000. Yeah. And so how all of these programs are administered is through the CAF agencies, and you all have gotten what I'm calling the CAF Map, because this can be kind of confusing if you're not familiar with this world. CAP agencies, community action programs, were started, the idea started with President Kennedy and wanting to have a war on poverty. And so there's supposed to be this great federal allocation of funds to fight the blight of poverty that maybe didn't really materialize. But this idea of having federal block grants going to states, and then the states deciding what to do with that money, LIHEAP, whether it's WAP, and then them disseminating those funds to their community, that they would know the best way to deal with that federal money. So there are 5-ish CAP agencies in Vermont, ish, because in the Northeast Kingdom, it's a little split between the services that are provided, and a little bit in the Champlain Valley as well.
Well,
But
it's 5 agencies.
There's 5 CAP agencies.
But there's a 6th agency that provides weatherization
Exactly.
in the Northeast Kingdom.
And another in the Champlain Valley that is like kind of related. Well, you all have maps that have the exact details of who provides what, and it's so much information that it can't really be captured on one sheet of paper. But I did my best. And then there's some statewide resources. So these are the agencies that are charged with providing that fuel assistance, electric assistance, crisis fuel. These are the local people or local-ish that you call to say, I'm having a problem, I need to apply for this program, how do I do that? And so they disseminate those dollars locally. And that assistance comes in the form of fuel assistance, electric assistance, crisis fuel, weatherization, and then there's some kind of local organizations like Angela's that are able to step in when these things or these guidelines are too strict or they don't go far enough. So I'll turn over to Angela to talk about what these different programs actually provide.
And we collaborate with Sevco a lot, by the way.
Yeah.
And so
Every day.
basically, yeah, so as you were saying, so fuel assistance basically, when you apply for it, and assuming you get it, then what happens is that a certain, so you're awarded a certain amount for the whole season. So that could be, as Paige was saying, anywhere between like $60 and like $1,500. So let's say you're awarded $900. That's the number we hear a lot for the season. So this it goes directly to your energy account, or to your fuel provider. So say you have an account with fuel or like Irving Fuel, then it just goes straight to them and it's a credit on your account. And this one lasts until you use it all up. And there's also some stipulations about if you don't use it by a certain time, then it expires. The money is actually dispersed around now. So like late November, early December is about the time when the people actually start getting access to it. So imagine that whole period before, like when it was snowing and up until now, like, so fuel assistance doesn't apply for that. So it's, this is really the set period between November and April. And you do have to reapply every year. You may hear it called seasonal or supplemental depending on your local CAP agency, where you live. But basically the idea is that it's about your income eligibility is 185% of the federal poverty level. And
So Vermont has said, 150, that's ridiculous. There are a lot of people in that range that need assistance as well.
And I have a lot of critiques about the federal poverty level as a measure, but like, for reference, like 185% of federal poverty, like that number has not kept up with, say, housing costs. So there are actually a lot of people, like, as much as I love fuel assistance and it's really important and helps a lot of families survive through the winter, there's a whole other like group of folks who can't afford or who make slightly too much money to qualify for this. So so we've been having people apply since July, because it also gets prorated, because if you start applying now, your benefit goes down. All these like stipulations about it, and so that's why it's like good to get to know your local CAP agency for it. And also one of the handouts that we gave out was the fuel assistance application itself, and I think that this is just a helpful thing to see about like what people have to fill out in order to actually apply for it, and like kind of get a glimpse of the process and the kinds of specifics that you have.
And we kind of want that to be your homework, is try to fill this out in one sitting and not get frustrated. Or understand what the question's actually asking you. And then think about if you had a learning disability, or you needed classes, or any other number of things that you might already have, but something that would make this more difficult for you to fill out.
Like sometimes, like literally the main barrier for people is getting to the post office. You know, that could be a big one.
Yeah.
Are these available in Spanish?
That's a good question.
I don't think they are, or at least
Because
if
the
they.
increasing migrant population with agricultural communities could really benefit from a form in their
Definitely.
language.
And you know what? I actually just got a question from somebody I was meeting with on Friday, who said, like, if my partner is an immigrant, then would applying for this affect my my partner's future ability to get citizenship? Would it tear apart our family for him to apply for fuel assistance? So there's that aspect too. I don't know if you heard of the public charge rule that is kind of up in the air right now, and who knows what will happen to it. So that's a big point of concern for people too.
Mhm.
In some service territories, there are multiple languages. So it's often up to the service agency, the service provider, to make it available in multiple languages depending on the client's level.
If they do have it, they don't make it easy to find on their website. Yeah, Ken.
How do you deal with a fuel dealer who refuses to deliver fuel because of insufficient standards in their tank? Have you started to see that coming your way?
Yeah,
that
so that we'll talk a little bit about that later, and what we're trying to do in the Upper Valley to organize around that. Yeah.
You were saying that if you apply now, you get less assistance?
Yes.
So it's kind of a first come, first served basis? Or what?
It's not exactly first come, first serve, but it is sort of like, well, if you apply in January, you've already gone for a month or so, of this cold weather, so you need less for the rest of the season. That's the philosophy behind it.
Even if.
What?
Yeah. Sorry.
It looks like this is not geared toward purchase of cordwood. What happens with cordwood?
That's included, right?
Yeah,
Forward
you can.
It
You
is
can.
included, actually.
Yeah.
You give your cordwood supplier's name then, or?
So for cordwood, it actually gets paid directly to the individual.
Okay, that's what I remembered it had been. I just
Yeah.
was wondering. But
There's-
it's not really made clear in this form. So somebody who's heating with propane and cordwood might look at this form and say,
I mean,
"Oh, I
it's-
can't get cordwood."
So this is one of the reasons why we actually give out this form, for people to look at. It's like to think it through what the experience is like to apply for it. Like all these questions are really great because we run into this.
And thinking about if you're filling out a question that requires you to have 10 other documents in order to answer it, that's a barrier for a lot of people. Yeah.
You're just saying that the money for assistance for cordwood is paid to the individual being the supplier of the cordwood, or
The
applicant.
applicant. Yeah. All right. So then there's also electric assistance, which obviously helps pay for electricity.
Yep.
And
So similarly, it is also based around the federal poverty level. This one is available year-round, so rather than fuel, which is that like this money is dispersed only at specific times. If you apply for this, then and you get it, then you can get up to like this one says 25% off. I think it varies in different places. Like so 25% off on your electricity. Sometimes forgiveness on your back balance, which is a really big hiccup for a lot of folks that I work with. And so this is something we also encourage people to apply to. And we don't have one of the applications here with us today, but it looks very similar.
Yeah. Martha?
A couple of questions. One is, where does this money come from? And you're listing Green Mountain Power. What about the other districts in Vermont?
So we did mostly statewide sort of reaching things. We didn't want to get into the intricacies of each electric cooperative. So I know
Other power companies do this?
Yeah, I know Washington Electric Cooperative definitely has a like a neighbors helping neighbors sort of program. It might even be called that, where there's a benefit charge on the electric bill that goes into a fund, similar to this GMP sort of program, but different than the fuel assistance, this is actually a special rate that is applied for lower income people. So it's a ongoing sort of thing. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question. This is not part of LAHI, correct?
No, I think that this is state run or state determined.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we not pay in our electric bills some sort of an electric assistance? There's like a little tax or
Yep.
a surcharge in
Yep.
there. And this is the same with fuel oil? There's a surcharge or a...
No.
Fuel oil is an unregulated fuel, or fuel oil is unregulated by the state. Yeah, Steve.
In Vermont, we do pay a percentage for which goes not to fuel assistance but to weatherization.
Yep,
To the
yep.
state-funded weatherization program, which is for Vermont 5 times as big as the federal grant we get. So that's
Yep.
a significant resource for Vermont residents that is funded primarily by percentage. It's now 2 cents per gallon, I think, when they changed it. It used to be a percentage of the dollar amount. Now it's 2 cents per gallon every time you get a fuel delivery.
And on your electric bill, yeah, there's a system benefit charge that goes into fund, essentially Efficiency Vermont.
So, I just want to add that to what this gentleman had said earlier about there's not enough money to do this. There is enough money to do it. And we have it, and we're not using it for that purpose. And I think that these programs, from what I can see here, don't solve any problems. They just keep people poor. They keep them in bad buildings. They keep them unhealthy. And if we aggregated some of our funding, granted, you're not going to get everybody done in a year, but we're doing nothing to improve it. And weatherization isn't the answer. Because it
So
doesn't do enough.
we'll get to some of the drawbacks.
But there's
definitely.
money.
I agree, but I would say that there are lots of people working very hard. A lot of them in this room.
It's misdirected.
I don't know that
In many
you
cases.
can say that
Because
any.
we're not improving the condition of the people at the bottom. We're just keeping them there and giving them more assistance and begging for more assistance. We're not improving. And granted, you might be improving something that they don't own, but nonetheless, these programs, although they are great when you need them, they are here year after year after year after year because we're not taking care of the backside.
So we will
Sounds
talk
like a
about
discussion for another time.
Yeah, we're running a little short on time, so we're going to try to get through the rest of the information here, and then we're going to have some time for small groups to have some more discussions.
Just a quick response to this discussion. I'm a social worker, and I used to work for Claire Martin. Now I'm in private practice, but when you help out a person who's making those choices between insulin and there's more benefit short-term and long-term psychologically, just for them to get their act together. You know, because otherwise they're too stressed out to do anything for themselves.
Yeah.
So we're really talking about need here.
Right.
And
Immediate needs.
Yes.
and when we're
Which
thinking
impacts
about
psychology.
when we're thinking about things like being in crisis, this is that medical emergency or that that car accident that makes it so you can't afford when previously maybe you could afford your fuel, but there's something that comes up. This is a little bit higher of a threshold from that 185 to 200, recognizing that if you were somewhere in that gray zone of maybe I can afford this tank, and then something happens that throws your budget off, this gives a little more wiggle room. And again, it's purchasing your primary source of heat or electricity if that is your source of heat. If you have a problem with your furnace and you need it replaced or repaired, this can go towards that. It can also help you negotiate a payment plan, so maybe you can pay that back charge without getting your fuel disconnected or your electricity disconnected. And this is again that same heating season. So weatherization assistance, trying to actually get at some of the root of these bad buildings. The eligibility in Vermont is based on area median income. So if you live in Chittenden County, your requirements might be a little bit different than if you live in Bennington County or something. There's a whole laundry list of people who are eligible for it, but essentially the reality of this program is that the people with the most need, the folks that are earning less than 60% of the area median income, are prioritized. So if you are 80%, you qualify. You can apply. You can be said, yes, you're in the program, but we're not going to get to you for 3 years, because for every time someone who's more vulnerable comes in, they are going to be put higher on the list than your household because of trying to meet that need. And a lot of times it will include these diagnostics, figuring out what's actually wrong with the home, making sure if it's if you have a bad roof, you're not just blowing an insulation and not repairing the roof. There's kind of this comprehensive work that's done, adding insulation, air sealing, and actually improving the quality of the home. And again, this is where your CAF Map will come into good use, and getting on the wait list is better than not. So even if it is a long time before you get that service, if you're eligible, you should get on there. Now to the drawbacks and barriers.
Which we've already touched on.
As you've said, I like to think of this $3.6 billion fossil fuel subsidy. This continues to be a bipartisan effort, LIHEAP funding, because there are folks on both sides of the aisle saying we need to meet this immediate need, and there are folks on the other side of the aisle saying, yeah, that sounds great, meet that need, because that's $3.6 billion, a lot of which is going for heating oil, propane, other fuels.
And the other person on the aisle is the fossil fuel lobby.
Yep.
Funding those.
Saying yes, we need
funding
this.
those policies.
Yeah, so compare that with 3 years of weatherization assistance funding. It's 3 years worth doesn't even add up to a third of the budget in 1 year for LIHEAP. So I agree with you that there is money that is going to places that is not solving the need, and that $3.65 billion is pretty similar year over year. It's always in that range of $3 billion or more. And that M and that B really matter. It's a big difference of funding. And I should also add that this is the federal allocation for that money, and as Steve pointed out, states do have their own ways of trying to supplement that. So I think the figure for 2017, there's $883 million raised by states to supplement that. So it ends up being about $1 billion each year nationwide that goes to weatherization, but that still doesn't hold a candle to the over $3.5 billion each year going to LIHEAP. And again, this tricky balance of the urgent crisis short-term need versus a long-term quality of life improvement. And Angela can speak to the complexities of poverty.
Right. So, I think when I think about poverty, my training also is a social worker. So I think a lot about how do we meet people where they're at. And I've met with plenty of folks who need help with heating assistance. And it's really hard to deny that fuel assistance and crisis fuel are really vital to them, especially if they're making choices like, do I pay for my heat or do I pay for my food? It's terrible that you have to make that trade-off to begin with, but these are the realities of their situation. And so a lot of the times it's really hard to even think about things like weatherization or building improvements, in part also because many people in poverty have the least power and control over where they live, what happens to their buildings, so part of this conversation I think is less about these individual people and looking at systems, but it's hard to get into that in the immediate moment where you're making this choice between insulin and heat. And so some of the one of the approaches that Paige and I have talked about a lot is when in terms of meeting people where they're at. So if I'm meeting with somebody who is looking for help with getting a fuel delivery, and saying okay, so let's help you get your fuel delivery, and then after that's settled, the immediate crisis is passed, then we talk about hey, so what's going on? Are you also interested in weatherization? Can I help you apply for weatherization? And that being in poverty, there are so many barriers. barriers that one would not even realize existed, such as, can you even afford postage to send in your application? Can you get to the CAF agency to ask your questions? Maybe your car broke down and you can't do that.
Maybe you don't have a car.
Maybe you don't have a car. Maybe you're dependent on your family members have a car. Maybe you are going through domestic violence and don't have access to the finances of your household. There are all, like, any number of reasons of which somebody might be struggling with this. And energy burden is, in my opinion, it's a symptom of poverty as a whole. And so while we're focusing on just the energy burden today, I think it's really important not to lose sight of, like, this is one of many things that are going wrong, not just with this person's situation, but also with, like, our system as a whole.
And I think that Bill did a good job, Bill McKibben, first name basis, I'm just kidding, did a great job setting up that climate change is this kind of great uniter of all of the problems that are happening. It's a good lens to look through if we're assessing any situation.
Also, isn't it that this energy burden, and we're looking at what seems to be big numbers, but the resulting, like the person with the insulin, and they can't do this, they can't do the resulting other social burdens that come in the cost of fixing the rest of the social burdens increases and probably makes these numbers look tiny. If
Sure.
you look at that,
And
especially on the health rate.
And it's interesting that LIHEAP comes out of Health and Human Services and weatherization comes out of DOE, and just the disconnect that displays.
Yep.
Yeah, Steve. Yeah.
I would just add that in Vermont, the state requires that anyone applying for and receiving fuel assistance automatically is considered an applicant for weatherization. So those of us who do the weatherization get those their application forms, and we then send out material to them to have them apply. If they refuse, they can be denied the fuel assistance. So there's a little bit of a connection, at least, in terms of recognizing that if they're going to be receiving public dollars in order to help them in the long run, we insist that we are able to make the investment to reduce the use of energy and make it more efficient, their homes more efficient.
And so things that you all in this room can do, or that we can all start to do together. First off, who's your CAF agency? Know that, call them up. Even if you are not yourself someone who needs assistance, figure it out. If you're in an energy committee, I've been on several energy committees, and it's crazy the lack of knowledge we have about what assistance is available, and that's why we wanted to present that today. Just understanding the funding, understanding the barriers, understanding what happens when you apply for fuel assistance, and helping someone navigate that whole world can make the difference. So as we talked about a little bit, Angela and I are the chairs of the Energy Advocacy Council, which is a Upper Valley group. We meet in Lebanon monthly, and it's service providers.
Just started in March, so we're pretty new.
We're brand new. It's a group of service providers. We have representatives from the Haven, cover the town energy, like kind of facilities managers in Lebanon and Hartford. Vital Communities attends. We have faith groups represented, and other advocacy groups that come to kind of talk about these issues. And what the rallying point to Ken's question was that there are all these fuel companies who are acting poorly. They were treating customers and clients of Listen or the Haven really poorly, kind of discriminating against fuel assistance recipients, everything that you're not supposed to do if you're receiving federal dollars through the fuel assistance program. They sign a contract that says we will not discriminate against fuel assistance recipients.
Yeah, so our initial impetus and like my interest in helping start the group was sort of like, I had been going to some other nonprofits that work with people in poverty and saying like, are you hearing weird stuff about like propane tanks getting locked and like people being denied their fuel assistance, or like getting extra charges and just all kinds of like weird stuff. And again, it is really expensive to be poor. Like getting nickeled and dimed for every little thing when you already can't afford stuff is terrible. So so a couple of other groups and I, we were talking like, yeah, we're all seeing something similar, and like maybe we should get together in a group and talk about it. And so initially it had started with just service providers working on poverty, but then we got connected to vital communities and to Paige's work, and then to groups like here, and so really looking at like, we had been looking at the sort of the short term and like the people-centered problems. And so I think one of the biggest benefits of this group has been a learning curve for myself, honestly, has been getting connected to this larger conversation about climate change and like the policy implications of all of this. So that like, and I think the real value in this is about connecting these like individual problems and experiences with these macro level solutions and conversations. And it's a work in progress, you know, like, it really depends on like the composition of the group. But a couple of the things that we've been talking about have been, for instance, engaging landlords in the process of improving buildings that a lot of tenants may not have the power or the time, honestly, in order to be able to improve their homes. But it's really the responsibility of the landlords and it would benefit the landlords also to reduce energy costs and things. So one of our long-term goals is to engage landlords in this kind of conversation. Another one
is recognizing that the unfortunately the volume of folks that come to Angela or come to the Haven that are seeking assistance, there are something like 5,000 families through one of the CAF agencies that receive assistance. $5,000 families times $1,500. That starts to add up, and if we connect all the CAF agencies on both sides of the river, because we're a bi-state region, that's power. You know, that is starting to say, okay, we have 50 grand that has influence over which company that goes to. Suddenly we can start to educate those bad actors, those companies that are maybe not being so great to the clients, and saying, okay, we would like to negotiate a fuel assistance buying club with you. We would like to see a reduced rate for our fuel assistance recipients, folks that we're referring to you, essentially. It's a guaranteed amount of money you're getting from the federal government for this individual. You should give them the same rate that you're giving someone who has a better credit score. And or another entity can step up and say, we'll back their credit rating. So we're starting to get creative in how we organize and how we wield this collective power. And I think Jared said it, the EAN, this collective impact model. Sure, one individual who's experiencing crisis maybe doesn't have the time or ability to think about these things, but if we start to gather these stories and see trends, we can say, okay, how can we educate the companies and the folks experiencing crisis to look a little longer term and to start to make some positive change? You had something.
So why is it that these fuel providers are acting inappropriately or badly? Is it because they aren't getting the full monies that they want, or they're just against federal dollars being spent to help others?
I think a lot of it is, well, you probably can speak to it better, but I think it's just that they don't even know what they're doing. I would say it's a little bit ignorance that they're saying, oh, you didn't pay your back bill, we're gonna lock up your tank until you pay that back bill, not realizing what obstacles you're placing in someone's way.
The less generous explanation that I see is that people in poverty have less power. Yeah. And so, I can't tell you the number of times I've heard clients be like, what they're doing to me is really unfair. I really wish I could sue them, but there's no way I could possibly afford that. And so I think I have this story actually. Do you mind if I?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, we have a client who she's elderly. She's on fixed income. She knows her bank account to the penny. She's literally collecting pennies in order to pay for the newspaper. And so she, her fuel and her she knows all her expenses to really in really great detail, more than I know honestly. And it's really tight. She can't because of her fixed income. Any small change would really derail her situation, really put her in financial crisis. And her fuel company came by this winter and filled up her tank.
She's an
but
oil customer.
yes, forgot to put the additive in that would prevent the oil from freezing in the winter. And so, you know, this causes all kinds of problems. And they said, like, oh, well, for us to come and, like, drive back out and to, like, put in this additive, it'll cost you $150 for somebody who's on, like, a $600 a month fixed income, right? And it turns out that they basically forgot to add the additive to everybody in her trailer park, to everybody's homes.
And they charged everybody $150, which to me that's negligence. That is negligence.
Negligence generously. So I think part of it is just that, like, these are people who have the least power in their situation and have the least recourse. So part of our interest in the Energy Advocacy Council is to have that recourse, but also to aggregate these stories and say, like, individually we may or may not have very much sway over how a fuel company acts or over legislation or anything, but as we know, collectively we can have impact if we come together. And so I think that's one of the biggest benefits of having these conversations.
I would say that there's a lot of that goes on. As one of the agencies providing fuel assistance to people, I would say I would give the more nuanced explanation of why that happens as being that it's complicated and that that many local fuel dealers are mom and pop entities. And they work with us really well to try to not only provide the fuel when needed, but refer people to us and work with us to be able to get them to qualify. But the problem is that you know, the fuel assistance provides only a portion, typically in Vermont 35 to 40% on the average of a person's heating cost for the year. So if we're talking about people who are largely unable to pay, then what's happening from the fuel dealer's point of view is they're getting the money from us, guaranteed, and what happens when that money runs out? Then the person is continuing to order fuel, and then not able to pay them. The fuel dealers are finding themselves because they've got to go out and buy huge volumes of oil at the rack rate and be able to predict how much they're going to use and so on. They get put in a very difficult financial situation, and they feel like they can't afford to take that burden. And so my position, all the years I've been doing this is, hey, we're giving you all this money, you ought to thank us. Their position is, thank you for what? Putting us in a situation where we then have to continue to support the people that you're subsidizing past the point where, because it's not an open-ended thing, it's only a finite amount of money. And from their point of view, I'm not talking about the big oil dealers, the big conglomerates, I'm talking about the mom and pop, small plumbing and heating kinds of places.
And I
that
will
also
say that
do fuel.
most of the bad actors who we've heard from and who are causing this kind of are not the mom and pop.
Right.
Those
so
are,
that's all I want to point out is that
totally.
it's not a monolithic kind of thing, and as with a lot of things, as with what causes poverty, it's very complicated. And the majority of the dealers that we deal with are very well-meaning and do the best they can. And in our experience, if they cause the problem that makes them go back to do a special trip, they don't charge. The special trip charges come when people don't look at their tanks and anticipate that they're going to be running out of oil and get the assistance before they run out, so that the dealer doesn't get to deliver it in the normal course of their route. They have to make a special trip to a completely different part of their service area for that one client, and that's what they say, I got to charge for it. It's who's going to pay for that additional cost?
And I'll also add that as a non-fuel assistance recipient, I've been, last winter, I was on an automatic fill-up and ran out of fuel twice, even though I was not. So I think that there's...
That's based on degree days, and if the reality of the weather doesn't match
major
it.
fuel delivery problems.
There's a shortage
Well,
of
last year
drivers.
Commodity type.
Yeah, there's kind of,
It's
again,
terrible,
geopolitical things happening that are out of the control of the Energy Advocacy Council or individuals.
It's not a simple supply and demand, it's very complex series of transactions.
And we've got just a couple minutes together, so I'm going to have you all turn to people around you to continue the conversation. We'd love you all to start thinking about ideas like the Energy Advocacy Council. What could you do in your community? What are your connections that you could start to bring more awareness about the assistance that's available, and then how can we go beyond what currently exists to change the system to be to more along the lines of what Paul would like.
Jason, can I just add one thing?
Sure.
There's one additional data point that I think is really important, and that is the $3.7 billion investment we're making annually only serves a quarter of the eligible population nationally.
Yep.
And I think that's a really interesting context. And also to the point earlier about the stopgap not being the solution, you know, after lunch there's going to be a session about the integration of solar into energy assistance as a long-term solution. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
Okay.
So
All right, everybody turn.
Can I pop in a note too on top of this? Sorry, but the you had mentioned about the impact, putting the doing things on an impactful basis by getting crowds around, you know, getting a lot of people to move the dial, and so I think that this is one of the things that can be done, but it is starting at the other end. It's a running it to death. There's hundreds of millions, we have several $1 million that get used in the state of Vermont, and you're not reducing your load at all. And there's a way, if you actually started, took your most needy person and made their building be to the point where they don't need any fuel oil. You've eliminated that problem. And the technology exists, you can do it to existing homes, and then the next year doing it. Yes, it's a big investment in one, but you have a ton of money that you're moving and you're putting none into it. And weatherization does not improve a home enough to the point where it doesn't need to have the fuel oil man darken their door. And the technology exists for you to get buildings to a point where the fuel oil man does not need to darken their door. And Vermont is a small enough state that if you did that, and the payback is so you could put more money into that program every year, and you would get the exact thing that he's talking about. You would then have a whole body, and in a few years you have maybe 10 or 15 houses that aren't needed, and you start at the bottom, the people who are the neediest, and you give them the best energy thing that they have. They'll live healthier, they'll probably improve, they'll probably get off all their programs because they will have a much healthier lifestyle. And we're spending millions, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars and not improving anybody in a meaningful way.
That's not true.
It is.
I'm sorry.
So I'd ask you all to turn. We only have a minute left together to turn to your partner.
Yes, sir.